All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's session. Today we have a special seminar, a guest speaker, Bryn Davies, who's been a friend of the course for many years now, right? I feel
7 years now.
Yeah, I was going to say 6 or 7 years. Bryn's been coming by and, talking to us about level design before when this was first starting as part of his role as was it the technical level design director?
Technical director of level design.
Ah,
And they switch it all
I
around.
always get those things
I
mixed
don't
up.
know why. Or
Anyway,
DP if you're in Montreal.
so that was basically the role that he was at Ubisoft at the time that we first connected, and he's been coming back and each time delivering a variation of what's been doing for the year before until it's gotten to the way it is today. Now Bryn's no longer at Ubisoft Toronto. After about 10 years, you've moved on to People Can Fly.
Yeah.
And before being at Ubisoft, you were part of Lionhead for about 6.5 years, working on the Fable games, which are, near and dear to my heart, having grown up with those ones. Anyway, but there's a lot more stuff that Bryn's going to tell you about himself. So I just wanted to say, today is very special because you're getting to hear a lot about what level design ideas you should be thinking about from someone who's been immersed in this for about 15 years. 16 years. So with that in mind, I'm going to give Bryn the floor, and yeah, I'll let you share your presentation with us.
Yeah, let's have a
So yes, thank you very much, Bryn, for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
No, lovely. Thanks very much for having us. See screen 2. Is this working there?
Yep.
Put my screen up here.
Yep, I can see it.
Lovely. Yes, hi everyone. My name's Bryn Davies. I'm technical level design director at People Can Fly, as Steve just said. There we go. So here's a quick summary of the things I'll be talking about today. About myself, we'll see, Steve gave me a lot of introduction there. But yeah, I was previously at Lionhead. There are lots and lots of Fable games that ended up putting out. Unfortunately, Fable Legends did not release in the end. Boo. But then, yeah, about after 7 years there, I moved to Toronto, joining Ubisoft Toronto, and at least games that shipped that I worked on there. Would be Watch Dogs 2, Starling Battle for Atlas, and Watch Dogs Legion. And then last year I left Ubisoft Toronto and joined People Can Fly, which is a studio primarily based out of Poland, but that has kind of a lot of, it's expanded rapidly in the last year or so, and now has sort of like satellites all around the place. And I'm working on something very cool, but also completely top secret and under NDA. So I cannot talk about it. Boo, sorry about that. First off, what exactly is a level? And even as I read that myself, I groan, because it can sound like an annoyingly obvious question, but it does bear thinking about because so many levels are so drastically different from each other, right? We have levels that are crafted to tell a story, that have a very sort of like linear narrative flow. We have levels that have zero narrative, or well, zero kind of like explicit narrative are in there, and maybe the sort of experiential kind of narrative might be what the players themselves create through gameplay as a multiplayer map or something like that. There's levels where it's different every time that you play, or sort of largely different every time you play. Other levels might be exactly the same. Obviously, every example we just kind of gave there was an environment to some degree. Well, Sayonara Wild Hearts maybe not quite as much there, but obviously there's a lot more sort of esoteric structures that a level can be, everything from a kind of a mission, a story, a challenge, a sequence. There are obviously many different forms of what could make something up here. And so to sort of condense it down, and you say that a level is the structure through which the player interacts with the game's content. It's the glue, it's the wrapper that binds all the mechanics that we use and the elements that we can interact with into a cohesive whole. It's also intentional, right? It's like it is specifically designed to communicate a particular idea to the player. Something that we will dig into a bit more. But yeah, that is to say, next, if I, in the most traditional sense of the word, right, if I take mechanics that, you know, the tools in which the player can kind of interact with things in the game, and then things that they might interact with, and then arrange them in such a way as to convey a specific design intent, then we get a level. Now, level design and its kind of its traditional counterpart, level art, are the kind of two disciplines most closely tied to creating levels in games. And I say that these are two specific spheres that exist. Depending on the size of the company that you work at, that might be one person's job, or it might be two separate teams of people's jobs, or it might get even more subdivided from here. Particularly when you look at places like Ubisoft, to have gigantic teams where people can really narrow down on one specific kind of element of these two parts. Level design is the sort of predominantly focuses on the functional part of how the level is going to play. Like, what can the player do, and what are you trying to communicate to them as a designer? Then level art sort of aims to ensure that the space is as sort of fully realized throughout sort of asset production, lighting, particles and such. It's the kind of ensuring that the space is both believable and, you know, sort of the full art pass goes all the way through there. In reality, we like to say that these two things are very separate, but both level art and level design overlap quite a lot in their concerns. And as I said, yeah, depending on the size of the studio, there might be one person who's doing all of these tasks at the same time. So I'm going to start to sort of walk through like what the level design process can typically look like. Well, how do we start actually defining a level? Like, well, what's the first thing that we need to do? Well, if we go back to the previous statement, right, there's kind of three things that we need to know before we can progress, because they're the three things that our level's supposed to be doing for us. So first off, the player, right? What is the player? That's not the person who's behind the controls, but like, what is their agency within our game? Are they a character? Are they just like a 3D camera? What is their sort of mode of being able to interact through this experience? And then how do they interact with it, right? What are the mechanics? What are the things that the player is going to be able to do? And then lastly, the game content, right? What do they interact with? Like, what is the sort of, you know, the atoms that go into building out my level? Now, these sort of three things, I think, from your course's structure will be something that you're going to try and answer with your creative briefs. For my example, I'm going to try and come up with something myself. And this is my extremely original idea, which wasn't just the first thing that came to mind. I present Steel of Honor. It's an entirely original third-person action RPG. God knows how I'm going to produce this on my own, but we're going to try. So I've come up with a horrendous sort of generic breakdown of this. Largely, the sort of core of this wrapper is that I'm building a third-person action RPG, which is completely over the top for a one-man team to try and attempt. There's going to be a sort of melee and range combat systems. There'll be a NPC interaction. All those different ability skill trees and things like that, variety of sort of inventory items, support different playing styles. The important part I wanted to sort of point out on there is that my approach is going to be more like having a sort of very constrained or semi-linear levels, maybe parts that I can kind of revisit and such, but that are not so much open world. I'm not going to build Skyrim. I'm going to build Breath of the Wild. It's going to be a lot more sort of controlled part to this. Maybe a bit like put Dragon Age is one of the things where they'll load into a section. Those are kind of actually quite large areas, but there's a bit like Borderlands again as well, where you're loading into much larger sections, but then that's what your constraint is for the separate level there. Okay, well, to start with, and to try and keep things simple, I'm going to focus on what in AAA parlance is usually referred to as 3 Cs: the camera, the character, and the controller. These sort of 3 elements define how the player feels the experience of piloting their avatar in the game. And it doesn't matter whether it's first person or third person, can actually be something entirely different from there. It's that hand feel of just moving around in the game, piloting that character. I started building this in UE4. I updated my slides slightly for UE5. I haven't updated the text there, but I just grabbed that. I'm going to use the UE4 mannequin as my player character, and I'm just going to have walk and run and jump and such for now. I'm not going to go too far into maybe I'll have climbing mechanics at some part. I mean, this isn't a game I'm physically going to be able to make by myself. But we'll start with the basics at the moment. My camera controls are going to be very much, familiar to anyone who's played a third-person game before. String and cage camera, there's going to be all sorts of different functions around that we can go into. I've got a rough idea of the direction I want to go in, right? This is sort of like high-level bubbles, but I don't actually have enough information to start building a level using this character yet. There is the sort of the specifics of my 3 Cs, right? Like how big my character is, how fast or slow they are, how the camera is going to move, where it's going to sit in relation to the character. But all of these are foundational parts of my game that many other systems, features, and content will rely on. The diagram here isn't necessarily exhaustive, and in reality we have a web of dependencies instead of this kind of linear hierarchy. But things like 3 Cs are so low level enough to be critical components that changing them fundamentally impacts a lot of other things, especially our level design. And I'll sort of pull out some specific examples now that you'll be able to see in action, right? So here I've got a test level I started putting together. I'm running around with my UE4 mannequin and trying to see, testing different bits and pieces out. And so the environment of my level is designed explicitly for my character to move in, right? No doubt about it. It doesn't even matter if I'm deliberately making a game where I am a giant and there's a small human world, whatever. My 3 Cs and the level are they conform to each other, right? They influence each other intrinsically, and so it's very important that the sort of environment's layout and navigation and such play well with the character scale. a lot of the design, the sort of game's design, including like readability of content. You know, what is something I can interact with, or I'm supposed to be able to interact with. The tuning of physics, spatialized audio and stuff like all of this can be, all of these things can be very dependent on the size of the character. Player movement speed. This is such a, I mean, this has a lot of other impacts. We're not even going to bother getting into loading, but that's a whole fun one. Yeah, try introducing cars into a game that's not designed for cars. It's always a good fun way to have a headache for a day. But yeah, so player movement speed, it's absolutely critical here. It's, you know, I have exactly the same space with obviously drastically different maximum movement speeds, and they feel very different to each other, right? Is my level too big or too small? Like, how long is this experience supposed to last for the player? That speed impacts that very much. And so if I built a level and then suddenly someone retunes the speed and now it's a lot faster, now my level doesn't feel quite big enough anymore. As I said, vehicles or mounts or horses or rockets or grappling hooks or anything else that has that in there, every game that has those, for the most part, the spaces are designed knowing that those would go into the game as an impact for that going in. And when they're shoehorned in, actually, you can notice that pretty bad because things start to get real clunky. Yeah, and you know, if you try and shoehorn sort of mechanics in to a space that wasn't designed with them, then you start to get into issues, right? Either you need to rework the level, or if you don't rework the level, then the space doesn't work very well for your 3Cs. It can feel bad. Wow, why am I hitting the walls all the time? Why is the space so small? I keep crashing my car. These are all things that come up quite normally in developing space like this.
Bryn, there's a question on the chat asking
yeah,
the reasons for choosing console over computer games.
Hang on a sec. Yeah, for some reason. Oh, there we go. There's my chat window. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I mean, when you switch to the chat, then it turns off the animation on your presentation. So I guess, yeah, you just go back and forth. Oh,
sorry. Yeah. Why? This is what would be the reason to choose console over computer game? When computer games have a big audience, I often see games that support both platforms, sometimes only console. That's a good point. And there's a lot of reasons for someone not to necessarily, let's say, only develop for one platform and not another. There are costs to developing for a platform. Now, like years ago, at least, when the differences between the kind of platforms architecture was a lot more drastic, it would be a lot more pronounced to say, well, like, yeah, we're going to be able to ensure that our game runs on, platform B as well as platform A. Nowadays, things aren't necessarily too far from each other, but it's still a big constraint. If you think about, big sort of point of contention would be the Xbox kind of, let's say the latest Xbox family, right? So you don't have just the Xbox X, you have the Xbox S as well, which is, like a stripped down, lower powered machine. To ship on Xbox, you have to ship on both platforms. So it has to run on the Xbox S. So you have a much broader breadth of the hardware specs your game has to support. And there's a lot of Xbox S's out there. As someone who, any developer knows that actually a lot of people aren't running their games on the even on PC. They're not running on the crazily kind of hyper expensive latest graphics cards that have come out. Most people are on a lot sort of lower end hardware, and so it's a juggling act between, well, how low a spec do you kind of aim for? That gives you a broader audience. On the flip side, do you have to, is there a certain quality bar in terms of like visual acuity that you're trying to hit? And that can be different for lots of different games, right? I think there's probably more pressure on first party game studios to make sure, if I'm owned by Microsoft and I'm shipping on Xbox, we've got to make it look good on Xbox. So there's those sort of things that come out of it too. Hopefully that answers your question. It's tricky picking, like anytime that you do need to work on additional platforms, it is additional work. It's testing on that platform. It's ensuring that you are meeting that platform's requirements to be able to ship on there, and going through that whole certification process and such. That's probably a whole other talk as well. But yeah, hopefully that helped. People might choose to develop on various platforms for different reasons, right? Particularly, there's also like, how are you sold on that platform? And whether or not am I sold on a disc, and as well as through Microsoft Store. Do I go on Steam? Obviously, all these different stores and such, they take a certain percentage. And so even indie games, a lot of it is going to be, I need to pick carefully what platform I'm going to try and ship on at first, because I have limited, I don't have infinite money, and I've got to try and sort of narrow, I need the game to ship at some point. So you've got to be careful about where you're picking your battles and such. I wouldn't say, no, like for developing on consoles doesn't necessarily mean that you have higher quality. It's a choice. You've got to pick where you're going to be shipping on.
I guess it also means your market. Like, you can have a whole conversation about mobile as well.
That too, yeah. Mobile, specifically, yeah. As I said, Yukons back there, so we can get a chat to them. But it's for platforms entirely, and like, or if you're shipping a VR game, right, or anything like that, it's knowing, how big is the market that you are sort of publishing your game towards, and is your audience for your game on the platform that you're looking at.
So I'm really keen about this slide, especially the field of view stuff. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I love this stuff. Yeah, hang on. Oh, there we go. My GIFs are playing now. Yeah, field of view. So many different games. I mean, like, really, like, sit down and look, like, any game that you want to look at, and look at what the field of view on the camera is like. It's different. It's very difficult to maybe gauge what it is, the kind of minute details. But doing a comparison of like one game to another, you can really get what the sort of the breadth of things are and why is it different. I'm trying to think of a good like comparative game now, because one of like an extreme FOV, like on 115 down at the bottom, right?
I remember seeing a talk at GDC where they showed the exact same racing game, and they showed like one field of view versus another, and one, the car seemed so slow, and the other one, it was like exciting because it seemed like everything was just whipping by.
Yeah.
But I don't know which field of view corresponds to which.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, you can see on, like, when you've got 75, it feels really sort of tight in and personal and close, and things are sort of squished up. You don't get as much sense of depth and movement. I mean, typically most games, most games in, let's literally just focus at like third or first person action games, will have changing FOV for different sort of uses, right? Everything from, I'm in a first person shooter and I go to, aim down scope or whatever, I've got a very different FOV to when I'm sort of back and I'm just aiming like regularly. Or like I'm sprinting, maybe the FOV changes there. Certainly the camera sort of positioning and stuff would tend to change a bit there. Yeah, no, the sort of super high FOV, the game always comes to mind because it was really extreme on it, was Vanquish. But that's like, that was a game largely about, you know, being in a bullet hell sort of crazy landscape and moving at very, very fast speed, and also running against the camera and stuff like that. That's a bit of an old game now. I'm trying to think of something else that'd be like that. But yeah, all of the stuff to do with the camera is very impactful about, you know, what your intentions, how you're going to build your level. The sort of, yeah, is the player occluded by near geometry or not? What happens around that? Especially if you have a fixed camera, or even if you don't have a fixed camera, do you do cutaways? How does that affect level design? If you're doing cutaways, like, oh, you know, all the roofs have to clip off. Okay, well then, if I can go up on that roof, when I go underneath it, can I have an enemy on top of there? What should happen to the enemy? Can the enemy see me? Etc. 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 It's a big, 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 big problem that balloons out. Basically, it's something that you need to have an understanding with before you start trying to build out, you know, a level that you're not going to be sort of changing and tweaking with. Yeah, all of this sort of like fundamental data that we're talking about here is typically referred to as metrics. This is something particularly on the technical level design side that ends up being a lot more in my field, dealing with these sorts of things, not just about you know, how a player might perceive certain things in the game, and also how certain systems function in a sort of environmental context. What are their requirements and such? Now, they're the rules that you can build on top of, right? That we can start to build out level design from. They can and will change during development. That's perfectly natural. It's the nature of designing, right? It's supposed to be iterative. The problem is that the greater the change and the more dependent that your game's mechanics are on those metrics, then the more knock-ons you have to deal with. And here, like, yeah, I mean, I'm starting to build, say, like a human scale space. There's so many metrics involved here that, yeah, it becomes very destructive. You imagine you've built lots of houses and then suddenly you need to change the ceiling height. In fact, I'm thinking here, my ceiling height's a little bit low, because if I jump here, I'm going to hit my head on the ceiling. Maybe that's going to be jarring. Maybe if I start cluttering things on the ceiling, I've got a chandelier hanging down or something like that, that's going to be a problem there as well. But there's more than that. Yeah, we start talking about minimum ceiling heights. So, like, all of these sorts of things, all of these, this sort of, when I'm iterating on a mechanic and I'm trying to get, like, okay, look, what is that metric? What am I trying to zero in on of, like, what I want for my game? Well, it's usually done best in an environment where you can focus on that, right? You're not getting distracted by other things, like there's a level that's got a particular story intent or such in there. And so people typically build a gym, right? It's something where you get to test these things in situ. And you might have one for all of your movement mechanics, another for all of your combat and AI. Maybe you have a conversation system, you're testing that out there. Designers and artists are typically also build gyms to test out or iterate on their own ideas. Let's say a designer has an idea for a boss battle, or maybe there's a environmental puzzle, or, you know, maybe it's just an idea from an artistic point. I have like a, you know, there's a particular image I have in my head and I want to try and sort of prove this out isolated on its own. You can prove something like that out in a gym. You know, you sort of test your design assumptions so that later on this content can be used as part of a larger level. So kind of the takeaways, a lot of this, I'd say it's important to get your core 3Cs metrics like 80% of the way, because a lot of changes to those obviously have knock-ons. There's the classic, I mean, what used to be the classic of hey, and the development of Mario 64, they spent like a year or sort of the first sort of like year or 2 years or whatever, just with Mario on a flat plane, getting the movement feeling awesome. Now, like, that's a pretty old game. That's quite a typical approach for people to take. In fact, the loading environment for Assassin's Creed is exactly that, right? It's a floaty space that you just run around and you get to jump and stuff, and sort of feel how the 3Cs feel. It's a good thing to do, because hey, if it feels great to run around on a boring flat plane, as soon as you start throwing in more sort of challenge and stuff into that, it's going to make it better. You can use your metrics to inform other design choices, like, do I restrict the heights of objects so that jump height can be interpreted by the player? Like, the player knows, oh, that's something I can jump on, versus that's definitely outside of my reach. And then really it's important to design with the player in mind, right? You fit the world to the player's metrics. It's not the other way around. You account for the player making a mistake, right? You try not to sort of mislead the player unintentionally. Like, say, for instance, having an explorable space in your level and someone goes off there and there's nothing there. And there's nothing that they could do there. And they're like, oh, that was it's a bit of a shame. Unless, of course, like your game, the experience of going there was part of your content, and there's something, the player's getting something out of it. If they're not, they're going to end up feeling disappointed. Maybe it's not a good idea to have that in there. So the sort of typical like breakdown of level design process. From here, let's say we've got our 3Cs, they're fairly solid. I've got some ideas of some, we've got some things I can interact with. We've got mechanics ready to go into my level. Great. Let's start by writing a pitch, and then we can start going all the way through the rest of the level design process. So from here, like I want to describe the space, like what is its features, what does it look like, I can get an idea of like, actually what am I proposing to build. A few sentences, just get the sort of get the that evocative sense going. And like, why does it exist, right? What's the player going to be doing here? That's pretty critical. Now here I've given myself the direction. I'm coming up with an optional area for my lovely game, Steel of Honor. And okay, so here is the pitch. I'll read it out to you, and I'm going to have you won't have to read this massive wall of text that I've given you to. Okay. On the edge of the kingdom's borders, the hero comes across a witch living in the woods. Her cat has gone missing, and she appeals to the hero to help find it. A band of trolls has moved into the ruins of an old fortress on the nearby cliffs, and she fears that they may have taken it. So the hero ventures along an old road that runs along the coastline, working their way up towards the ruins that look over the area. They make their way into the ruins, now refortified by the trolls. They can hear the cat meowing. It must be close. Finally, the hero finds the cat. But to their surprise, the trolls are taking great care of it, and the cat seems pretty happy in its new home. So here maybe the hero has to choose to, well, do I do the heroic thing and I murder the evil trolls and then return the cat to its rightful owner? Or do I, hey, the cat seems to be having a good time, so I side with the trolls, and then I convinced the witch that I was too late to save the cat. If the cat is returned to the witch, she thanks the hero profusely, then proceeds to kill the cat and prepare it for her dinner. Now, all right, we'll get to unpacking this in a moment, but the best thing about working solo here is I don't need anyone to sign off on this. I don't even need to write a pitch, to be honest. I could have just start building this. This literally is the first idea that popped into my head when making this presentation. And that's kind of the downside here. I'm proceeding with elements of rather unoriginal tropes, and yeah, proceeding with the first idea that popped into my head. But don't worry, we're going to take this further. So let's start breaking this down and start looking at like the elements of how this is going to sort of play out, right? So okay, we had like the edge of the kingdom's borders. So it's okay, it's like it's wild, it's secluded, it's undeveloped land or something. A witch living in the woods. So like, what is her home like? How does she influence the landscape? Or, you know, that's something that people influence the places that they live in, right? There's a cat. The witch had a cat. Obviously, we need to understand that from her home. It's a very important sort of point here. And then these trolls, again, like they need to affect the landscape. We know that these ruins have been refortified by them, right? So then how have they influenced this ruin? How is it now designed to be used by the trolls? What did they do to it? The ruins of an old fortress. Who built it? How old is it? Nearby cliffs is the road that runs along the coastline up towards the ruins. It's very evocative and kind of get the idea of the landscape and this kind of thematic progression as we go along it. And then the trolls are taking great care of this cat. Cat seems pretty happy. Obviously, like this is a juxtaposition to the initial vibe of the quest. So to play on this a bit more, like I need to build the tension towards that moment where I do the old switcheroo. But then also, like, how can the player understand how well the trolls are taking care of the cat? Again, another dependency that I need to think about. Then we really sort of move into the reference gathering, right? Now, this is done for a number of reasons. And reference gathering is done actually kind of separately by a lot of different groups for different reasons here. But for level design, like, I need to understand and utilize the shape of particular references, right? Like if I'm going to design a ruin on a clifftop hill overlooking a forest and a coastline, I kind of need to get a sense of like, what are the rules for and the sort of shapes that make up those sorts of spaces? Like, how do you build that? And, you know, obviously to make it realistic, players going to understand that these things kind of fit together. So I do, much as I'm not going for a realistic rendering style, perhaps, it's still an important part to be the realization of how these things fit together. I need to learn how to connect to these parts like naturally. This needs to be believable. And then also I need to fill in these kind of the missing pieces with external ideas or generate new ideas from specific references. Like maybe I come across something, let's say, you know, I'll find something in a reference and I'll go, wow, that would be a really cool element to bring in here and kind of change the way I'm thinking about this space. And so I start to sort of go through like, okay, cool. Like what are the shapes and things in the real world that I could pull from here? And so I went and I combed the internet. Google image search was my friend. I mean, hey, I could have just used Midjourney. I don't. Reality, who needs this anymore? But yeah, you know, a couple of minutes searching for images, and you come up with a lot of things that can show you, oh, okay, right, I can kind of get, you know, some of these shapes and how these things. Maybe if I take a bit of this and I put it together with this. Well, yeah, a lot of these places are in England. There's actually a lot of the Jurassic Coast in Dorset. There's Corfe Castle in there. Lots of places, kind of. That's the sort of vibe I'm going for. I mean, maybe this is feeling a bit too fakey at this stage, anyway. But you know, it's all right. I'm ripping it off. Yeah, then the woods. You know, actually kind of an important reference point for me. It's an important reference point. It's a sneak peek. It's an important reference point when we were building environments for the Fable games was the English countryside versus the sort of North American, or you know, other places you can see. I've lived in Canada now for 10 years, and I go off and go camping all the time. It's amazing out there. I love the sort of, you know, Canadian Shield. It's got a very different feel to the kind of the what I like to think of as like a tended garden of English countryside. It almost feels like it's like someone is coming in and sort of, sort of fixing things up for you. It doesn't feel especially wild, but it does feel a little bit sort of magical to an extent. And all of these parts here, this is a variety of kind of different forests scenes that I found throughout Dorset, and that's the sort of area I'm riffing off here. Okay, so I got all these ideas. I need to plan this out and put this into fruition. So this can be done a number of ways, right? And it's important to keep in mind why you're doing this. So why are we doing this? So I want to put a sort of broad overview of the design on paper to help communicate to other stakeholders, other people who are making this game with me. And maybe in this case, we're a larger company. Hey, I might not be building all the assets for this. Maybe I need the artists and such to be involved in here too. I could be coming up with all sorts of like work for someone else to do. So I need people to have buy-in. And the creative director and level design director and people like that, the leads, whatever, they're going to have input on this as well. The second part as well is that putting a plan together can help prove out how the levels should flow. It's testing the idea before you even try and build them, because you can start to see where things are missing. And that's a good reason why you might do a plan of something before jumping in into just throwing something into 3D. Now, these are some 2D maps. It's actually what they're. One of them's from Dark Souls 3, one of them's from Valorant. I think both of these maps are obviously classic. These are maps done after the game. In fact, some of the best looking maps I've produced were all done as part of, it was like being included in a game guide or something like that, being used on the internet somewhere to show people where the secrets are in the level and stuff like that. But the actual planning documents look terrible compared to this stuff. Still had a kind of overview of how things are fit together, but not nearly as polished and stuff as some of these do. Now, the two, as I say, the two maps, they're misleading for the quality bar you might be aiming for, because they've been made after the game's been made. They're teaching a player to find stuff here. The prevalence of 2D maps in this sort of setting, it reinforces the idea that a level designer should sketch out in 2D with a high degree of planning and accuracy. Personally, when I review someone's 2D level design plans, it's more an exercise in demonstrating whether the designer has thought about how they'll fill their space, right? And the map's accuracy and the fine detail is ignored. It doesn't matter that you've come up with like, oh, I'm going to put a palette here, I'm going to do that. That's too much detail. But the broader sort of like, oh, okay, well, I can see how this room connects to here, but have you thought about maybe these things will start to impact each other? That's what's important. Now, from another preference here, and this is something that I like to do, is doing flow maps. And you see actually, when I started doing this, and some people at Lionhead were doing it, people didn't typically share the documentation styles. And so I didn't know, it was a bit like, is this wrong? We should all be doing 2D maps. But it turns out loads of people do flow maps too. And it's kind of a nice way to, I understand how the logic of this space is going to progress and how all these different pieces are going to fit together. It's highlighting the themes, and it's highlighting all of the different sort of broad, like high level goals of how things are going to fit together here. Now, not every level design has such autonomy. Sometimes I might be starting with a piece of concept art, and I might be designing a design space around a visual that someone's already come up with. And similarly, if we get this in and we start building it in 3D, we might get a concept artist to do a paint over. So I might have some sort of shapes and such in there, and then it's the concept artist that's injecting the kind of, how are we going to realize this over the top of that, and that helps further develop the visual style of the rough block out. production flows vary from level to level and project to project. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's just generally how you might approach it on different projects. So these are tools that you can use. There's also here, I mean, this is a flow diagram of the quest, right? We came up with our quest. Well, now I can at least talk about the main beats of the quest, like what is happening, what is the player's experience as we go along here, what are the decision points, how does it progress as we go through the environment. Now, like the quest primarily involves, we speak to the witch and we head to the ruins, we confront the trolls. We've got the decision, how do I side one side or the other? I don't know if that's a conversation system. Yeah, we can come back to that later on. And then we've got the kind of the quest resolution that sort of splits off in two, and a resolution on each branch. Yeah, as I said, you can find these sorts of flow diagram things all over the industry. It's very common, certainly for mission design, but you also use them spatially as well. Yeah, I was very happy to find that Sonnet 2, particularly Dana Nightingale's one of the who's amazing level designer on there. It was also the campaign director or campaign lead. I think campaign director for Deathloop. There is some amazing things with the ways to the side. There is a million links I can post to you at the end here. But the breakdown of the Clockwork Mansion from Sonnet 2, amazing. The talk from Dana Nightingale from last year about the UX of the sort of onboarding for Deathloop, also amazing. I will share all of those at the end. But the Clockwork Mansion is like, it's a masterclass on level design. It's so good. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on as an aside. So, okay, right, I've got some plans now. I've got all these sort of bits, noted down. These are all the sort of pieces, and I've got an idea for where I'm going to be progressing here. What am I supposed to be doing? So we're going to start by kind of getting the higher level of the piece, higher level pieces of our environment put together in 3D. Right, we're not going to use detailed meshes or anything else like that. We'll get to that. Everything's going to be extremely simple. Right, the first things I need to do is to try and gauge like functionality, but also like, let's say some of the earlier points we want, like how big the level should be, what the sort of spatial relationship is between all of these different elements. What does it look like? Does it work? Are there things that are the problems with it so far? So that's what we're going to start to jump in with first. And so I had a very rough sort of, I've stuck some bits in. I got some checkerboard cubes and a horrendous checkerboard landscape, and I'm starting to sort of build things out on here. It's extremely rough. The most important parts of the level go down first, so I need to know like how big is this space going to be? Because shortening a level, especially one that's like set in a natural environment where I can't just hide things by moving a room or whatever, cutting a corridor, it's going to be a lot of work if we do that later on, right? If someone makes this cliff look really nice, it's going to suck to have to remodel the cliff. So I kind of want to get a sense for how big the space is, and go, okay, like how's it going to work here? Now the nice thing here is that because I might be able to eagle-eyed see, I've measured how long this stretch is. And the reason there is that well, if I know how long the path is and I know how fast my character can run it, then I can gauge for how fast it might be to move through the space. If I'm not doing anything, of course, right? But you can start to lay down like rough, like, okay, like is this too big? Is this too small? And getting a handle on it, how much this content is going to start breaking down. As you see as well, I use block colors for everything. The point is I'm not trying to do art at the moment. I'm trying to do intention. I know that green is grass and gray is rock, and that, you don't walk on rock and you walk on grass. I also, as well, and it's dithering horribly on here, but I use checkerboard. You'll see most people use checkerboard on their sort of block out materials, because you can understand distance, how fast your character's moving by seeing the checkerboard move. If you've got no pattern on the landscape, you can get a perception of how fast you're going to go through of this. Oh yeah, sorry, all of this stuff so far is just being built in Unreal. I'm just like, I downloaded Unreal and kind of started putting some stuff together. Prior to that, yeah, like the flow maps and stuff like that, just in Flow. I can't remember, it might have been in Inkscape, or it might have been in something more modern than that. But Inkscape's free, so it's free is good. And just I cut a little like separate shot here just to get this is something we'll come back to talking about a bit later on. But yeah, so I've measured the sort of distances out. One of the things I'm trying to do as well with the kind of the shape of the landscape is get a sense of kind of composition. There's a progression here as I move from the kind of tight confines of the forest. I emerge into a much wider landscape. It's probably not going to be completely barren like this one is, but the sense is going to be there, emerging into a kind of opening here. This is typically what is in architecture referred to as circulation. The perception of like moving through a confined space, the perception of speed is faster than moving through an open space. And this is used all over the place in level design. You can see great sort of talks from other people showing this in all the kind of level designs there. It's a nice way to sort of mark a transitional point. And here I'm trying to like crest over this little hill, have the sort of the quest laying out before me and all that kind of stuff. It's simple enough. And here I'm starting to work into like, okay, like what's the composition? How do things lay out? What is the path beyond from the player? How does all of those things sort of fit together? This idea of sort of composing a landscape for a fixed camera in a particular position is quite common. Like you frame that composition. And you might sculpt everything around it. That's you're thinking about this. How is this going to look when we ship? Now, like I'm looking at this, and I'm like, oh, you know what? That ruin could be higher and a bit further to the left, and then we get that. And is the sun in the right position and stuff? It's just intentions, and a lot of these things will start being broken down a lot more as the world gets worked into. But part of this is like getting the different depth layers working, right? As you begin to run along here, you get the sense of parallax as these trees are passing you by. You can see the perspective shift of this little islandy sort of bit that I've got the ruin on. You'll start to see that sort of branch out and move around. So you're designing around how the experience of moving through your environment is going to work. Okay, right. So I got a lot of like just the most basic points in. I started grabbing some screenshots of some like random bits of the level I started putting together, and it's like it's super rough. I'm generally just trying to gauge, how much space do I think I need for each of these things? Are they too far or too close together? Do I need more space? How are those things going to work? The things are obviously far from done, and there's a lot of work needed. The forest is terrible. There's literally all I've got in the forest so far is kind of I'm not getting anywhere close to the sense of what I want. Actually, the forest is going to take a lot of work to break down, particularly as a forest that I want to come out from and be able to look back on and see, like looks like a forest. But obviously I want it condensed because it's a game. I don't want to literally be trekking through this forest for hours, because I'm expecting to have this part of the forest as part of the map, where everything else is as well. And I need to get that sense of wanderlust of kind of getting lost in those woods. And that's going to take a lot of work to get into. Things are very far from done, right? I have all my sort of pieces here and I have these plans, but I'm not going any further. This has a lot of major issues. In fact, a lot of major issues that should have stopped me. They should have stopped me getting past even just these initial flow diagrams. Now, maybe I'll pass over to, feel free to like type into the chat. What are the issues that you can see just with this documentation here? What do you think my problems are? How could the player get back to the witch quickly? Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if they have to, especially, do they have to run all the way back through the level? Do I teleport them back? Is that kind of a bit jarring? What if you never make it to the witch's house? There's that too. Yeah. What if I don't go to the witch's house, but I go up to the ruin? What if I go off into the open fields? Yeah. I never get to the trolls. Do I need to be sort of fenced in to like prevent that? But then also, I don't know, do I bump up against a fence in a game where I can jump? And I go, why can't I jump over the fence? Who made this game? About any other issues people see with this? And say anything you like. There's also that, yeah, nothing stops the player from falling off a cliff. There is that, yeah, that could happen there. And yeah, backtracking and stuff like that. Okay, I'll jump into like my issues with this, and I should say as well, one, there's a reason I ran with this idea, because one, it was a stupid idea that came into my head, and two, particularly it reflects some of the ways that certainly when I first started doing level design, some of the things that I maybe miss, that it should be caught at the stage where you start to do documentation and stuff like that. You could kind of you could start to kind of condense these down. Yeah, and so yeah, as you say, so the open road is slow and the forest is fast. Feel like that could be hard to achieve. Also, boring scenery. You're definitely on to one of the things I'm going to talk about here. So, all right, the 3D of the level, this thing that I was talking about with this coastal road and seeing a ruin up on the cliff, all this kind of stuff, right? That's the bulk of my environment. It's huge. It's really expensive. What I mean by expensive, not from an engine cost, there could be that to it as well, but just from a production cost, like how long it's going to take to make that look really good, which isn't necessarily a problem, right? But I've got one box, travel to ruin, which is that. It's that whole section. I don't have anything else planned to go into this level, but like 90% of my level is that. And that's kind of a problem, right? Because it's the most expensive thing that I'm going to build, but it also has no purpose for existing. That's kind of a big problem, right? It's also, I guess, from the quest point of view, like the missing content in the middle. Like I'm heading up to this ruin. I'm going to go and rescue the cat. Now, once I get to the ruin, oh yeah, it's going to be all sorts of fun and games there. But on the route, like, what am I doing? Am I fighting things? Am I fighting trolls? If I murder the trolls along the way and then I get to the end, I mean, that's going to change the tone of everything, isn't it? That it doesn't feel right. And really, that's kind of a problem here, because I could quite easily continue building this level. And then eventually it's like, oh, this is kind of boring. Let's put some trolls down on the road. And you run like 200 meters and then there's a troll. And then maybe you run another 200 meters and then there's another troll. And you kill the trolls and then, I don't know. And you're like, great, it looks nice, but like, I don't know, it's not very exciting. Then there's bigger problems than that, right? There's tonal dissonance. So both of the quest resolutions in the game are unsatisfying, right? If I deliver the cat back to the witch and it's like, hey, I won, I did the quest for you and I killed the trolls, then it's kind of like a switcheroo, like nothing to do with my actions. I just get like, oh yeah, there you go. Actually, you did the bad action. That feels problematic to me. Like as a player, I don't feel cheated by that. But also, then what am I trying to say as a designer? Like, is it funny? Is that what I'm trying to do? Maybe I don't know. It feels just like a raw idea that I haven't really explored properly. Then, just in a general sense, right? It's very derivative. Okay, there's trolls. I assume that the witch was female. There's the trolls, the ruin on the hill. These are obviously very super, common elements. And there's not an especially exciting kind of thing about their use here. There's no magic source that makes this memorable. No one's going to go and play this and then turn around and go, oh my God, imagine this level that Bryn put together. I'm like, no, it's like, this is boring. How do we make this more exciting? And as I said, this could ship, right? We could shoehorn some stuff in it and we could probably massage this a bit more and, make it work, right? But I think that fundamentally the space I came up with and this quest idea are kind of ends with each other. I need to resolve some things there before I think I can make a better level where these both work together, right? This quest content is supposed to be the reason that my level exists, but it's not really working hand in hand. Now, the two things how this works, right? I got attached to two things. There was the twist with the trolls and the cat, like, haha, the trolls are actually being nice to the cat. And then there was the visual of the ruins on the cliffs. I thought, oh, it's very evocative. I like that. And so everything else that I did for this level was to ensure that was just shoehorned in around those two elements, right? I wanted to keep those and I didn't want to change them anyway. And I feel if I kept building this level, I'm going to keep making ad hoc fixes to it just to kind of like ensure that those two things stay, even though I don't think that they're working in the level's favor. As I said, kind of paraphrase, right? This is the point of making a level. It's supposed to be where the player interacts with the game's content. And I didn't know what I was doing for most of the quests. So that had ended up being a pretty big problem. And so I'm going to nuke this entire design. I'm going to throw it away. I'm going to start again, right? Which is to say there might be elements from here that I'm going to take. I think that could work really nicely. But this thing, no, let's throw it in the bin and start again. So like, what things could I keep from it? Well, like I like the idea of finding the lost cat and then discovering that, the cat doesn't want to be rescued. The sort of unwanted rescue is, it's a classic trope, but it could be fun, especially from a cat's point of view. I'm not imagining the cat's going to tell me he doesn't want to be rescued, but, you can get the idea that the cat's having a good time. But I need a better way of setting the story up. And, we want more satisfying resolutions other than just murdering things. That's not very satisfying, is it? But we also need like some meat on the bones, right? We got these bookends, like finding the cat and then the cat doesn't want to be found. But like what happens in between? There's lots of things we can come up with that could happen in there. That's the point of revisiting this design, doing it again. The other part of it as well, I think actually was something I know Jamie mentioned when we were giving feedback on a lot of the initial pitches and such, is about tonality. Like, what tone are you going for? Like, what are you trying to say with this quest? What is the Is it subverting kind of, you know, classic fantasy tropes? Is it something more serious you're trying to say here? Like what is that comes not only from the level, but also I guess from the game. Like, is that tonally suitable for your game? And so, yeah, you know, I took you through that. I thought, oh, you know, Bryn's going to make this level, and then what? I just threw it in the bin now. And you know, if you take anything away from this process, right, it's that you always try and evaluate your designs as you go along. You think about like, what is the player going to experience as they're playing through this? And if something isn't working, then just ditch it. You can throw the level away, you can redesign it, you can repatch, whatever. It's a normal part of the design process. As I like to say, everyone's first level is terrible. Most levels that I built that shipped have been torn up and thrown away a million times over. And, you know, especially later in development, that can hurt. But you know what? It usually ends up better for it. You can learn from you know, rejected ideas, right? You can use them later on to refine into kind of later designs. And then peer review, right? It's very difficult to get a sense sometimes if it's something that you're really excited about, is it hitting? Is it going to hit for everyone else? And so getting team members and such to look at your ideas, having things play tested, play testing things early can obviously, you know, get you answers about how things are working sooner rather than later. Okay, well, so there was more a course in how level design can go horribly wrong. But then, okay, like what is good level design? What does that mean? Is it just personal preference? You know, if I say this level is good, then that must be that I'm right, and that there's or is there some sort of metric that we can use to measure good level design? You know, it's a good thing to think about of like what you feel good level design is. If there's levels that stand out to you that you're like, yeah, this level's amazing. There's one quote actually from someone, Joel Burgess. He's currently the student director at Cappy, studio director at Cappy. He was the world director on Watch Dogs Legion. And prior to that, he was a level designer for a long, long time. Certainly when I started doing level design, he was like one of the people, you know, who all the other level designers are watching their GDC talks for. He worked on Skyrim. And they're like, oh my God, you worked on Skyrim? Wow, you guys like made all these crazy levels and stuff. He had a quote saying, yeah, good level design is when the level designer is high-fiving the player, which I really liked from that, right? The idea around this is that you are not fighting the player. You're not trying to like kill the player or stop the player from being able to complete the mission or whatever. Like, you want them to win. You also you want to challenge the player. You want them to feel smart. You want to give them, you're trying to give them tools. You're giving them a situation whereby the player interprets how things should work, and they use that to try and inform how they're going to play in a space. And when that works, when that syncs up, that's the moment where the level designer is high-fiving you, because hopefully that's where like it's intentional. The level designer is doing something to make sure that you feel awesome playing that moment of the game, and you're obviously rewarded through your choices. So a couple of little examples. I had to record GIFs for these, so apologies. I just got some like slightly blocky GIFs in here. And a lot of my examples are kind of focused around like, you know, AAA games and things like that, just because it's a lot of space that I'm very used to working in. The recent-ish levels as well, and sorry if there's spoilers, but yeah, this is old, so it's fine. Into the Abyss in Titanfall 2, and Effect and Cause were made by the same level designer, Christopher Dion. If you have an Xbox or you have Game Pass on your PC, you can play Titanfall 2 for free. There is an awesome GDC talk on this level as well. It is not just a a great narrative build up that happens in this. It's not just like an on rails story, as much as you can see you're on rails, that's playing out in front of the player. It's also it expertly uses the setting that it's building up into as interesting navigational challenges that really like highlight very early into the game Titanfall 2's movement mechanics. Super cool. It's a great little space here. Next up, I might have mentioned this one earlier, but yeah, the Clockwork Mansion, which I mentioned earlier on in the talk. Dishonored 2 has a lot of great levels, like little mini mechanical sandboxes. You go off and explore with all the different sort of abilities that you can possibly have in the level in Dishonored 2. But this is just like, this is the one everyone always remembers and talks about. It's just like, oh my god, it's just just all the shifting of the level in different states. Oh, it's so good. Definitely check out the talk about this. I think Game Maker's Toolkit does a breakdown of this level as well, which is super cool, and they talk to Dana there as well. It Takes Two, so I updated this talk a little like during the pandemic, and It Takes Two was one of the games sort of stood out for me during that time. Was like, oh, it's the perfect time for this game. I'm a sucker for like couch co-op games as well. I like that, but It Takes Two is very much every single sort of level and zone. There's so many little mechanics they end up sort of putting into there. I think the spaced out level is pretty good for the variety of stuff and the different challenges that they had there. This is also a really interesting space to look at as well. And you think about a space that's designed for multiple player characters, right? We've got a giant character and we've got a tiny character. And they're different abilities as well. With May, the smaller character, has this sort of anti-gravity boots that she can use to run up different walls and stuff. So it's very cool. So as a level designer, you first and foremost are the advocate for the player. You are not the adversary. You are the person putting together. You kind of anticipate how the player might want to play. The best level designers anticipate player strategies and legitimize them, ensuring that they can function in the level instead of forcing a player to follow a specific resolution. I used to have a side, but the game is so old now, but there is a great write-up about it, and they did do a new version of it, of Call of Duty Modern, I think it was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1, right, which has all gillied up, which is the kind of like very heavily scripted narrative. Oh, you're just sneaking through and you're in a ghillie suit and all that kind of stuff, because there is a whole alternate path. If you decide to go off and go full action hero, guns blazing, you can, and you can complete the level and do whatever things you need to, and they've entirely built that in, even though obviously the narrative intention is to play through this sort of this tense part. If you're the kind of player that doesn't want to do that, they've legitimized that, and that's really cool, especially as a player who didn't know that was even in there. So coming back to like how does the level designer communicate with the player, right? And if I look back at this sequence in Spaced Out, and I urge you to play It Takes Two, because it's got some great sort of like neat little level design bits in here. But you can see there's a lot of like visual design that goes into communicating where the player can go. Obviously, there's these walls that are in red. They sort of prevent the ball from rolling over them. There is this sort of glass tiles following along in green that is used to sort of designate like where is the player supposed to be going to. There's also obviously a break. There's this red going over that, so you can tell, okay, I'm not supposed to be going there with the ball, right? And I mean, the reason why there is May can go up there with anti-gravity. it's all very sort of like simple visual language that's helping inform the player. Oh, I understand what the rules of this are. Now, I'd say that with a little caveat, because these red walls are pretty low. The first time I came into this puzzle, I was like, oh, I bet I can roll the ball over it. And you can't. But, you know, it kind of almost feels like you would be able to. So that kind of stuff can be kind of tricky. Now I go super heavy-handed with this, but there is a lot of this kind of like standardization, standardized visual language that a lot of games try to put in to communicate very simple ideas to the player. And it's been taken to a lot of extremes, particularly with AAA open world games. It's almost like there was a big summit a few years back, and then everyone collectively decided that yellow was going to be the color of interactables. Given Horizon does this, Far Cry does this, a bunch of people kind of, you know, riffing on the same things. As with Far Cry, I think they went extremely heavy-handed in their color usage, with the red equals bad, blue equals good. In Far Cry 6. It's kind of riffing on very similar things that they've done for a lot of the previous games. But it is a bit, you know, I find a lot of it can jar, it can feel almost to its detriment, because, you know, it doesn't feel like you're being communicated to. It's more like there's a really big sign saying something to you, and you kind of, it's almost like you're feeling a bit stupid for it. Like, I don't necessarily need to be told that strongly about it. So, you know, good level design, ultimately, it's giving the player enough information to make their own action evaluations, right? The sort of Don Norman's design of everyday things, making things visible, right? Making it so that someone can understand, read on that. It uses careful sort of employment of constraints. So we want players to be able to evaluate a smaller set of variables. They can understand their relationship to each other and then execute their actions based on what they understand. We also need to sort of understand and support users who are learning how the level or game operates, whilst also ensuring that we don't gate expert players, right? That's a kind of a difficult thing to judge there. And then you see this a lot in mission design. You know, you go and get the key from over there, right? And where the mission can account for you doing that goal before you've necessarily spoken to the mission giver. But a lot of the times you get things that are happening out of order, and so you need to account for that still. Like, oh, you already got the key. Oh, great. Okay, well, you know, go in. It's jarring when it doesn't account for that, and you're like, hang on a sec, I have the key, why can't I get in through the door? What's going on? So sort of building on that, like, there is a lot of level design theory that can help inform these sort of ideas for you, and this is really how good level design is achieved, is through applying these sorts of rules. If you look at the relationship between the level designer, their intent, kind of the level itself, and the player, it's kind of like describing you know, the three conceptual models of from design of everyday things or emotional design or whatever it's used all over the place now, right? The level designer strives to have the user, in this case the player, form a conceptual model of how the level or the mission works, matching the original level design intent. And so when we look at level design, specifically environmental design, we can start to apply these design concepts more specifically to break it down into a kind of a set of the skills shown here, which we'll go into in more detail. So layout is, it's part of flow, which we'll get into again. It is a key element of how the level is arranged, the metrics that govern how it's shaped. A level is a functional space first and foremost, but also needs to make sense. If you're building a human space, a house, a street, a city, something that's kind of recognizable there, the player needs to get the impression that the level has existing functionality outside of the game's use. On the left here, actually, yeah, this is going about sort of from a great GDC talk on the level design of Gone Home. And on here, on the right, we've got our Watch Dogs Legion map that's kind of superimposed over actual London. See, it's nothing like actual London. There's quite a lot of stuff that's been cut out from there. The point is it needed to evoke the same feeling as being in London without necessarily, referencing London one-to-one. My favorite, climbing dead zone. So this is from the Watch Dogs games. It's very difficult. There is a maximum height to which the player can climb. The player can climb 3 meters. It is very, very difficult to perceive, let's say, between 3 meters and anything up to 4 meters from a distance. Let's say you're being chased by the cops. You need to know that you can escape down that alleyway. And then suddenly you run into a wall that you can't climb. And you're like, that sucked. I thought I could go that way and I couldn't. So the solution around this was to go, okay, well, we'll have a distinctly kind of unclimbable wall, something that tells you from a distance, you cannot climb this. That was 5 meters high. And then from 3 meters up to less than 5 meters, no, we do not have walls of those heights. We try and design around having that in there so that as the player's running around, they will not see a space that looks like maybe they can climb it, but then they can't. As you see, like having a jump height that's that looks like I could make. No, I can't. Oh my God, it's so painful looking at it. Same with like distances between objects, all of these kind of stuff. This is obviously going to inform how our spaces are designed. Flow, sorry, not flow, but pacing, which is another part of flow, is the rate and intensity of experiencing content in the level, right? And it's crucial to obviously see that the player doesn't get too bored or too frustrated. And points of low intensity, it may be a good time to tell someone a bit of backstory or whatever, or teach a new mechanic, because you're not under pressure, you've got time to focus on it. This is specifically kind of designed at part of the level design stage, and this is a little map we had from one of the levels being designed on Splinter Cell Blacklist, where they would track the story pacing intention of part of the level against what the gameplay pacing is. Like, what are the things that the player's doing against that, to ensure that when we need to deliver story content, we're doing it at such a point where we've already planned not to have a lot of other stuff going on, being shot out, climbing it, sneaking through somewhere. And then, as we mentioned previously, circulation. It's the routes people take through spaces, the perception of speed of travel based on the metrics of that space. As a level designer, you have a great amount of control over where the player can and can't go, and you can influence them with sort of subtle options to make them feel like maybe they're making their own choice about which way to go, but they're actually heading towards the goal you always intended them to take. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is quite often used in a narrative context, right? It's as with sort of weenies and any of the talks people do about everything I learned about level design, I learned from Disneyland, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of gameplay kind of application to foreshadowing too. Like, hey, in a Far Cry game, I always have a kind of a layout somewhere where I can get an overview of the base to plan out. In a moment of low action, I can plan my attack into the base. I can, work out what I'm supposed to be doing and strategize. Similarly, in an action rhythm game, right? The track lets me perceive what's coming up. I can make decisions about, oh, well, I'm going to have to make this move coming up, so I know where to put my hands or anything else like that. Similarly, like crop in an infinite runner or a platform or something else like that, you're feeding the player the information that they need to evaluate future actions without necessarily overwhelming them. And obviously, whilst a lot of narrative content is developed, done by speech and text, environmental storytelling is still a very powerful part of it. There are sort of signs and cultural symbols, there are compounded ideas. The player draws their own conclusions about what these places are. You don't necessarily have to have very heavy-handed graffiti and blood saying stuff on the walls. This all kind of works with foreshadowing too, right? The sort of this shot from Elden Ring on the right, it's one of the sort of it's a reward almost actually for coming out of making it past that first boss in the first area. It's kind of like passing the tutorial, and coming out here is seeing like, oh, the world is opening up. I'm seeing all of the challenges before me, and I know the different areas that I can head to, and where sort of, you know, all the further challenges for me are going away. Now, players of your game obviously got preconceived ideas of how things work in games, right? Because usually they've played lots of other games. Red barrels are the most classic example. It's a design trope that's used so much. It's often difficult to subvert. And I tried finding the talk. There is definitely a GDC talk from People Can Fly, because it was from Bulletstorm, about their attempts to make the red barrel yellow in Bulletstorm and how it didn't work. And they really wanted to make it yellow and no one understood it. But it's very funny. This comes up in game design all the time, right? I mean, if you have drivable vehicles in your game, which there are lots of games with drivable vehicles, then you're contending with existing control schemes. Like, you know, you're trying to find a way in which, on the one hand, you don't want to have to teach the player loads of new things, or why do you have to be different in your game? But on the other hand, you've got different mechanics to someone else's game, so you need to have somewhere meeting in the middle. You'll have this impact on your games if you choose traditional control schemes, right? Like, or maybe if you choose to represent recognizable objects, like can your player jump or not? Can your player open doors? Are doors openable? Doors is a whole other talk. Liz England's talk on doors is probably the best thing to watch on that. And in a lot of games as well, I was amazed that I could put Hitman 2 and unpacking on the same slide here, but we're doing it. You know, designers will use implicit social cues from the real world to guide players to understand how the game functions. So like the Hitman games are this entirely, and there is a great talk actually about the level design here of making implicit public and private areas as part of the level design process and how those flow together, that the player can identify and then realize that those are sort of the private areas, those challenges. How do I get into there? You know, how can I strategize about how to get into there using those public access areas? Unpacking relies a lot on this too, right? It's leveraging the player's familiarity with human objects in order to understand and explore the limitations of their placement. However, this can also become a trap, as explicitly, maybe you assume in Hitman, oh, like this character, this costume should be able to access this area, but for some reason they can't because, you know, the game has to limit me somehow. That can be kind of jarring. Or unpacking, like, hey, like this object should be stackable, or don't tell me I can't put this in this drawer. Like I could put this in my drawer at home. I can put the colander over here. Don't tell me where I can put this stuff. And it can be a bit jarring there, where you rely on the player to go, okay, well, I can use my own understanding of the real world to feed off this, but then you turn around and tell me you can't. There's a lot of times there you need to break player expectations. I'll probably, given I want to have questions at the end, I'll just send you a video. You can watch a video of I specifically found a YouTube video of someone playing the first Metroid where they go right. It's very important. But I'll send it out to you afterwards. But, you know, like Metroid, the first Metroid is probably one of the earliest and very kind of like classic examples of trying to break people out of the ideas of how a platformer should work. you know, when we're in the era where, you know, Mario starts left and he runs right. Metroid is very much a game that is not that, right? You can go in either direction. You have to explore the level. You find mechanics that allow you to unlock previous, you know, paths that you couldn't take previously. And so fundamentally, the level design of this opening area is geared towards that. It's like you cannot progress through the rest of the game without understanding those core tenets of Metroid. That obviously, this kind of vibe gets repeated all throughout lots of modern day games as well. And hey, they remade Demon Souls, so I got to update my screenshot here. But Demon Souls had this entirely as well. Lots of games do this, but Demon Souls was one of these too, where I'm like, there's the inescapable boss, the Vanguard demon, and yeah, you can kill it one time, and then I think they make it invulnerable, so you can't, because you could sort of cheat it and get in the corner. But like, you need to get killed by it. And obviously an inescapable, unwinnable fight doesn't sound very fun, but then it's a crucial part of redefining the player's understanding of how Demon Souls works, because you need to know that it's okay to die, right? If you die in the game, it's not the end of the game. You don't switch it off, you don't reload or whatever. It's not death is just a sort of secondary state to be in the game. It's another mode. And so it's important that you learn that, even if we need to be heavy-handed to do it. You know, firstly, the players of your games, they're going to have preconceived ideas of how things already work. So using pre-existing design paradigms and help, you know, kind of avoid needing to teach the player new things. Obviously, if you've got anything that is different in your game that, you know, is different to the norm, you might have to be heavy-handed in order to teach someone it. You might need to, you know, constrain things to ensure that someone learns how it works before you let them loose on it. And obviously, yeah, utilizing kind of pre-existing design paradigms can be very useful there. Oh my god, I have loads of links. I started spamming some things here. I have more links from here as well. But there is a lot of fantastic talks and such about level design. People, you know, actually going through some stuff at GDC. Much better stuff to look at. And Game Maker's Toolkits was good. Checking out Blocktober on Twitter all the time, that's always good fun. Everyone jumping in and sharing their blockouts is always awesome. But I will try and share all of this with you as well, so you can go and click on links or go crazy. And that is it for my presentation. I somehow got a little bit of time left, but made it. It was a bit longer than I was expecting it to be from the first tape, but yeah.
I think we had that feeling last year too, that it was like, oh, actually this went a little longer than I expected. But okay, at this point, I'm gonna stop the recording and take a moment just to say thank you, Bryn, for coming by and spending time with us to tell us all the different things that people need to consider when it comes to their levels. We'll take a little time after this to just answer some general questions people have about their games, but I'll stop the recording here just to say, you know, thank you very much. We very much appreciate the time and expertise that you share with us today.
Thanks so much.